welcome back to the Korea Now podcast. I'm your host, Jed Lea-Henry. And on today's show, we're talking about a author with a newly released book. So the book we're going to be speaking about today is Soju, A Global History. And the author, of course, is Park Hyunhee. She is Associate Professor at City University of New York. And it is a fascinating new look into not just the alcoholic drink, but also deep history between Korea and China and Mongolia. So, Hyunhee, thanks for joining me on the podcast.
Hi, Jed. Thank you for having me here.
Absolutely, my pleasure. It really is an interesting book. And of course, for listeners, I'm going to link it below. I think as a very first question, we should just start very simply for listeners who may not know what soju is, may not have much of an understanding of it. So as a very first question, what is soju?
Okay, so what exactly soju is? So actually, that's the most basic question, but actually it's not easy to answer quickly. So that is a major theme that I explored throughout the entire book. So basically, soju is a clear and colorless alcoholic liquor or spirit with higher percentage of alcohol, more than 20% in general, often much higher. Soju is the distinctive spirit of Korea, even considered the national spirit of Korea. For those who have not heard about soju, you can compare it with other more globally famous spirits like vodka. Soju's taste is similar to that of vodka actually, and some other spirits like gin and brandy produced by the distillation of fermented grains or fruits. But in fact, it's not easy to define Korean soju quickly because soju evolved over time, re-emerging in different forms in different historical contexts. Here, let me try to define this as clearly and simply as possible. First of all, we can see there are two kinds of soju right now in the 21st century Korea. So first, soju brands that many people can taste at Korean restaurants nowadays at a quite reasonable price would be an industrial soju, mostly in green bottles. This is produced on a mass scale in factories using modern technologies that rapidly mix water, flavors, and most importantly, ethanol spirit of 95% alcohol taken from potatoes or tapioca. So this particular method and recipe were devised in Korea only in the last century, the 20th century, thanks to the introduction of modern Western technology and its continuous developments to the present. So when we talk about the kind of soju that has become popular in the global marketplace, that means this industrial soju, this has now become one of the world's most popular drinks, largely thanks to the almost universal pop cultural phenomenon of Korean wave, Hallyu. Recently, I heard that Jillo Soju, one of the big brands, became the number one selling spirit in the world. But we should note another type of Korean soju available now, that's a traditionally distilled soju. That is what I explored in most chapters of my book to trace soju's history. Before this mass-produced industrial soju developed in the 20th century, so Koreans developed a traditional soju for centuries, starting in the late Koryo period in the 13th century, and the entire Choson period after that, and by the early 20th century of the period of Japanese colonial rule. So this is soju made by traditional Korean distillation methods, that is, distilling fermented alcoholic drinks based on grains using Korean distillation apparatus called soju kori. The distillation apparatus is called still in English, and I don't know how many English-speaking people also know this term because I didn't know this term, and when I began to study this topic, I had to look up my English dictionary, and sometimes I'm going to talk about this term today. Anyway, the Korean still called soju kori is quite similar to some of traditional stills used for distillation in other parts of Eurasia, particularly those in China and Mongolia, which experts categorize as Asian style still, different from European pot stills. I put several images of these medieval stills in my book to help readers understand what they are. In order to trace the origin of soju in Korea, we should also discuss controversial issues of the development of spirit and distillation technologies developed in the wider world that preceded the rise of soju in Korea, because the spirits of other countries like China surely influenced soju. We should note that the word soju is a Korean transliteration of the Chinese word shaojiu, meaning roast liquor or cooked liquor. Shaojiu is a Chinese spirit better known as baijiu, white liquor. But the transfer was not direct. In fact, the transfer of shaojiu from China to Korea involved a more complicated historical situation, such as the cross-cultural contacts between Korea and China that were influenced by the Mongols in the 13th and 14th centuries. So this traditional Korean soju is made by a similar distillation process of fermented alcoholic beverage that spread in Eurasia from the Mongol period. So this traditional soju developed into many varieties based on different recipes in the Choson period from the late 14th century. This was also used for many occasions like medicine, diplomatic gifts, Confucian rituals, and so on. But this soju declined once the new machines and technology for mass distillation were introduced to Korea during the Japanese rule period. Then the Koreans got used to the mass-produced industrial soju in Korea that developed when the country was suffering from grain shortage in the late 20th century. Then the Korean governments made efforts to revive the traditional soju for many international games that they would host, such as the Olympics in 1988. Many new brands of traditional soju made following traditional distillation methods based on fermented alcohols began to boom through these governmental efforts. And some of them, like Andong Soju, began to receive international fame. So in short, now we can see the two quite different kinds of soju coexist: industrial mass-produced soju and then traditional soju. Thanks to the global fame of the industrial soju, traditional style soju also began to receive people's attention, though less popular yet. But I recently heard that some of these traditional soju are sold online right now.
So that's a great start, and you've touched on a lot of important things there that we're going to go back to. And I think the first one I might go back to is I guess chronologically the first one, the Mongol period. So let's go back to Eurasia and Mongolia, because reading your book, I believe it's in the first chapter or the second chapter. This is where it starts. This is where soju, or at least the origins of soju, begins. So let's go back there. You did mention the Chinese origins, but there's also another liquor, arak, I believe it's called. And yes. Let's go back to the Mongol period and talk about how that technology transfer happened into Korea.
Oh, yeah, thank you for the good question. So actually, this is the topic that led me to study the history of soju. So I originally planned to focus on this topic, the Mongol roots of soju, in my book. But later, I expanded the scope of the book to cover the modern times in order to explore soju's further transformations. So I have been working a lot on the Mongol period since my PhD to explore cross-cultural contacts between different societies in pre-modern Eurasia. The Mongols' continuing expansion of territory produced the largest empire in world history, stretching from Hungary to the Pacific during the 13th and 14th centuries. The Mongols were infamous as brutal conquerors, but recently scholars have reviewed their contributions in world history, such as their genius military strategies. We also pay attention to the international cross-cultural contact and the exchange of goods and ideas in their transcontinental empire that followed the bloodshed of the Mongol conquest. So we see also a bunch of globetrotters, such as famous Venetian Marco Polo, suddenly appearing in this period. So my book explores soju's origin involving large-scale Eurasian cross-cultural interactions and technology transfers growing out of internationalism of the Mongol Empire. So it is the period that witnessed a sudden spread of distilled liquors, distilled spirits in Eurasia for the first time, and large-scale spread. And these distilled spirits also began to appear in Korea for the first time. There are several sources that strongly suggest that this spirit is popular in the Mongol Empire. Both shaojiu, that's Chinese original term for soju, and arak, another distilled liquor. These shaojiu and arak were transferred to Korea at the time through the Mongol connections. The transfer of spirits from the Mongol Empire to Korea even serves as a well-documented case of the spread of spirits at the time. So in this book, I argue that we can even use this Korean case to explore further spread of similar distilled spirits in the broader area under the Mongol influence. So let me explain the situation of Korea at the time briefly. So the Korean peninsula was ruled by the Koryo dynasty. The Western name for Korea, the Korea, is derived from this dynasty name. Like many other regimes in Eurasia, Korea was first conquered by the Mongols and became part of the Mongol Empire. It had close political and cultural exchanges with that as a kind of a vassal state. But there have been some very different theories advanced about Soju's origins and early development in Korea too. For example, some argue that the Koreans had distilled liquors before the Mongol period. We cannot deny the possibility, but simply we cannot find hard evidence for that in the extant sources. So some existing studies published a few decades ago in 1980s already suggested the Mongol period transfer theory, but they did not go deeply into important aspects of the historical context and technology transfers because they didn't have enough sources at the time. And so as many new extensive studies about the Mongol Empire in the late Koryo period have been published recently, I was able to review all the relevant sources and situations to give a more convincing explanation about particular transfer ways. My book's comparative explanation also strongly supports the Mongol roots of soju. In other words, looking at the world's historical development of spirits as a whole in the Mongol period confirms the origin and development of soju on the Korean peninsula from the late Koryo period. In fact, the origins of the distilled liquors for popular consumption have become a topic for heated debates within a larger context of world history. And I explored their roots and transfers in the first 3 chapters by examining all the existing theories and to provide a convincing and updated assumption.
So let's talk about that actually a little bit, because that is very interesting to me. You mentioned a few times the documentation. So I might ask you at first, how hard was this research to do? Because I imagine, as you hinted at a few times there, that the actual documentation must have been very hard to come by.
Oh, yes, that's a really good question. I studied many topics about the Mongol period. So I was very familiar with those sources and about the travel accounts and accounts about the commerce. But about the soju, this is a completely new topic. And when I was suggested by my colleagues that I participate in their comparative research of the distilled liquor, I gladly joined it immediately because actually I believed that there are many studies about soju in Korean, and I was very sorry that actually soju was not studied well by other Western scholars who do comparative studies on the distilled liquor, because there were not many Korean sources about soju available. And my colleagues who started this comparative study of distilled liquor heard about soju because it's becoming so popular, and asked me what I know about this, and I just Googled and I found some very interesting information. It's about the Mongol transfer theory, but the information was very short. But anyway, I started working with them and began to work on soju. And I realized there are not many studies, even in Korean. So the most substantial studies about the transfer of soju, shaojiu, and arak to Korea were done in 1980s, and there were not many English studies about that. So there are some English studies, but they just copied those simple explanation, and there were not major studies about that, and a lot of studies didn't cite the primary sources, and so I was a bit surprised, and I had to dig out from the very primary sources in Korean and other related documents to trace the primary sources, and I found a lot. I was so excited whenever I had new findings with this, and so I was trained to read many documents in the primary languages like Chinese and also Arabic and also Japanese, and I'm a native English speaker of Korean, so those things helped me to work on this project.
And my next question, of course, comes from something you've said as well. What did the landscape, the alcoholic landscape, so to speak, look like in Korea? So you said before soju arrived, there was alcohol on the Korean peninsula, but the documentation is a little bit hard to come by. So what did it look like? And who drank it as well? This is an important question. So before soju arrives, who was drinking alcohol in Korea? And what did it look like?
Yeah, so because there are not many studies about the history of alcohol in Korea in Western languages, not many people outside Korea actually know about this. So, but I was surprised that there are many documentation about alcoholic drinks in pre-modern Korea. So in order to prove that these distilled alcohols that spread in the Mongol period, shaojiu and arak, were transferred to Korea in 13th and 14th century. I had to study the different documents written in Korea before the late Koryo period, before the Mongol period, and so where compared to the modern period, like Choson dynasty, there are many more literary sources, and of course for the modern 20th century, there are many more sources. But for the pre-modern period, it's more difficult to find sources. But we have some sources like China. There are not very many, but there are several literary sources written by scholars and also official chronicles, and the poems and interesting novels, those and envoys reports. So these things, also Chinese sources too. Yes. Examining all these sources help us understand the landscape of alcohol drinking culture in the pre-modern Korea. So in the Korea's Three Kingdoms period, the earliest Three Kingdoms, then we have two major documents written in the Koryo period, but written based on the earlier period. And there are a lot of interesting stories about alcohol. There are not many, but there are several very interesting stories about which are more like myths and legends, but some of them make sense. And then we have more documentation about wine in the Koryo period. both Chinese documents and Koryo chronicles that were compiled in early Choson period based on Koryo period sources also give us very interesting information about alcohol drinking in Korea. So, for example, Chinese envoy Xu Jing traveled to Korea as a diplomatic envoy, and he talks about Korea wines, and he didn't like Korea wine because he thought it's different from the Chinese wine. Chinese is like sticky, based on sticky rice, but Korea wine is based on glutinous rice. So he just didn't get used to that, probably. And actually about the Shilla, earlier, the Three Kingdoms period, some Chinese sources, one Chinese poet actually praised the Shilla wine. So, but everyone has different taste. So he also, the Song dynasty and the Chinese envoy from the Song dynasty in China to Korea, Xu Jing, also talks about two different kinds of alcoholic beverages in Korea. One is for the noble people and the other one for the more ordinary people. And actually this is written in the Korea official chronicle. And so we learned from these two Chinese and Korean sources that the brewers used special compression brewing methods to make high-grade liquors for the nobles' use. And it's clear strained wine in Korean Cheongju. Actually, it's similar to sake. It doesn't have a high percentage of alcohol, but it's very clear and different from unstrained liquor. Turbid unstrained liquor that was for ordinary people. So they compressed turbid unstrained liquor to make clear strained wine, Cheongju. And about the turbid unstrained liquor, farmers consumed this wine in their fields and travelers drank on the road. This could have been similar to modern day makgeolli, a milky off-white, lightly sparkling white wine that contains a slightly sweet and bitter and astringent taste. And it's easier to make than other kinds of alcoholic drinks. And today, actually, it became very popular too, first in Japan and some other countries. And so there are many other, some other interesting sources about that. Some literature show that the Koreans actually brew alcohols using grain. And one very interesting literature that was developed at the time is personifying like the different ingredients of alcoholic drinks, like person. So and those names are from the different parts of the grain alcoholic drinks. So we can guess that they used grains as alcohol to ferment to make alcoholic drinks, and also so we also began to have sources like poems by literati that attest to a variety of wines, including many kinds of grain fermented wines. And some of them might have also have used fruit or other ingredients. In our sources, we see various names for alcoholic drinks, such as like pear blossom liquor, flower liquor, pepper liquor, and so altogether 25 different kinds of alcoholic drinks. And so later sources show that the Koreans continue to enjoy most of these varieties until the second millennium, like Choson period. Then soju arrived in the late Koryo period through its Mongol connections. And before soju appears in the late Koryo period documents, we cannot find any alcoholic drink that looks like distilled liquor with higher alcoholic percentage. So, the Mongols made Korea into a vassal country, and despite the Mongol social and economic exploitation, Korea was a son-in-law state enjoyed its autonomy and its really substantial autonomy. And so many of the Korea people travel to cities, including capital city in the Mongol Empire, in China, in Mongolia, the Daidu, the modern day Beijing, and they participated in some festivals and communicating with the people there who began to drink a lot of spirits that began to be popular there. So let me introduce three extant evidence for the rise of soju in the late Koryo period under the Mongol influence. The earliest evidence of soju drinking from this Mongol period is related to the soldiers. So actually it's the Korea soldiers, but I argue that many Mongol soldiers went to Korea when they conquered the Korean peninsula, the Korea, and the Korea surrendered. And the Mongols brought a lot of alcoholic drinks because it's important for that kind of military campaigns, and probably brought soju. And once they conquered Korea, they also worked with the Korea soldiers to go to Japan, to conquer Japan, although the campaigns failed. But so anyway, so the Korea soldiers probably were influenced by this alcohol drinking technique and alcohol drinking culture from the Mongol soldiers. And one very interesting piece of evidence in Koryo-sa, the Chronicle of Koryo, says that there was a soju gang or soju group that enjoy drinking soju too much, and they didn't do their duty. They were just having party and drinking soju. So they were punished by the higher ranking general. So we can see that at the time, soju began to be popular, at least among the Korea soldiers. And another evidence in the same official history of the late Koryo period shows that soju was among the very expensive items. And it's an edict issued by the court, and it prohibits the purchase of soju and other expensive luxurious goods such as silks, gold, and jade wares. So because many people bought soju, they had to prohibit, they had to ban this. So I argue that this evidence suggests that the liquor, the soju, had become very popular among nobles by then. Most likely the rich people, wealthy merchants, and as far as they could afford it. And we have another very interesting piece of evidence from the same historical period. It's written by a Korea scholar who traveled to Beijing, Daidu, the capital city in the Mongol Empire, and he passed the very difficult civil service examination in China. So he was very smart, and he wrote a lot of poems. And sometimes he talked about loneliness as a foreign student or foreign scholar in another country. And but he had a lot of contacts with Chinese scholars, and probably he learned about soju. And in fact, in a poem, this scholar talks about another distilled liquor, arak, not soju, arak, as like distilled liquor. He says, he describes this liquor like forming like autumn dewdrops and dripping down at night. After drinking half a cup of the liquor, a warm feeling spreads to the bone. So we can guess that this is actually describes a distilling process, extracting strong spirit from the fermented alcohol. So we can see the Koreans had two kinds of distilled liquor, the soju and arak. And the Koreans also refer to soju as noju, like dewdrop liquor in the later period. And this term noju, dewdrop liquor, is only found in Korean sources, not in Chinese sources.
Well, that's a good way to ask another question that we brushed over a little bit earlier about arak. And you touched on it a little bit there of just how centrally important this liquor is for the later development of soju. So let's go back to arak then and talk about why that is so important.
Okay, that's a good question. So in order to understand what these drinks are and how they are similar or differ from soju, first, we have to study the development of soju in China, shaojiu, meaning roast liquor or cooked liquor. Let me explain to you about shaojiu first, then arak. Mm-hmm. So shaojiu is Chinese word from which Korean soju and Japanese shochu derived. So you can see how they are connected. So while we can find shaojiu in earlier sources, scholars agree that shaojiu as distilled liquor began to boom in the Mongol period. Existing scholarship, especially the many volumes by Joseph Needham, a great scholar about Chinese science and technology, did a magnificent job in exploring developments of distillation technology and distilled liquor in different societies. For example, the scholars found out that the distillation technology already developed in ancient China, but at the time, it was more for distilling mercury to make elixir of life. And it seems that they developed the technique to distill alcohol much later. But the existing scholarship was less successful in making some important points, such as the coming of arak, a foreign distilled liquor that helped distilled liquors more popular in China, and the roles of the Mongols that promoted the spread of the distilled liquors, including shaojiu and arak. So, as you ask the questions, I believe my book's readers will be intrigued to learn that distilled liquors were also widely called arak in many parts of the Afro-Eurasian world, including China, Korea, and Japan, not to mention the Middle East, from where the term arak originated in the first place. The word arak for the liquor originated from the Arabic word arak, which means sweat or perspiration. It referred to the essential drops created by vapor during the distillation process. The earliest mentions of spirits in the Koryo sources include both soju and arak, as I just told you earlier. In China, arak was also called Southern Barbarian shaojiu, meaning a distilled liquor of foreign origin, similar to Chinese shaojiu. So some of you may have heard about arak, a spirit found in the Middle East, Central Asia, and South and Southeast Asia today. And so the scholars just began to study all these distilled liquors more deeply and from more comparative perspectives. Let's come back to the Mongol period. So we should explore the history of arak and its sudden rise in China in the Mongol period. In the Islamic Middle East, distillation developed more to distill other things such as rose water and not alcoholic drinks. So as religious alcohol ban worked to some degree, still we can find a few, not many sources of arak as spirits in the Islamic world. But surprisingly, the very first source that testifies to arak as a distilled liquor is a Chinese source from the Mongol period. So it is the dietary manual for the Mongol court in China. This provides the first extant documentation of arak as a spirit that is obtained by accumulating small drops of liquor with higher alcohol content through a distillation process. And another Chinese source from the Mongol period says that arak was transferred from foreign countries through southern maritime routes. And they call this southern barbarian or foreign soju. So by the Mongol period, the people in China got both shaojiu and arak as distilled liquors. So these two kinds of distilled liquors would be transferred to Korea too at the same time. So the three extant sources from the Koryo period, two of them talk about soju and one about arak. So.
I really hope you're enjoying this episode of the podcast, and I apologize for this interruption, but I'm just going to take this moment to remind our listeners that we've made a conscious decision here in the Korean App podcast not to run advertising in any way. So if you do enjoy the podcast, and you listen regularly, and you do want it to continue, it is important that you do your best to support us at the links below, or by sharing, liking, or commenting on the podcast across social media. All your help in this regard is invaluable. And now back to the episode. So from that, I might step us forward, if that's okay. I think, so we touched on the Mongol period, and we've touched on Koryo. And we should run through a little bit more of the later chapters in your book as well. So, of course, at some point, Koryo falls and the Choson dynasty takes its place. And how does this affect soju at the time? So throughout your book, it was really interesting. It seems to become more popular. It seems to become a drink that is drunk in the king's court, in the higher dynasties here. It's also has really interesting questions about it. As it becomes more popular, it seems to imply that the country is also becoming richer because they have excess grain and things like this. So how does soju change during the Choson dynasty?
Yes, indeed. Really, soju was once transferred from China to Korea in the Mongol period, in the late Koryo period. Soju, it seems like soju became very popular and it spread quite quickly to broader areas. But we don't know how much it was consumed by the people in the early Joseon period. We don't have many sources for the ordinary soju drinking, but the official chronicles, the Shillok, veritable records written by the court historians, talk a lot about consumption of soju by noble people, and it's used as a medicine, and also it's used as diplomatic gifts. So it often says the court prepared many bottles, like 50 bottles of soju and 50 bottles of cheongju, clear strained wine, as a gift for Japan or Ryukyu, Okinawa, the kingdoms. And so we can see that soju was used for that kind of rituals and diplomatic gifts. And many noblemen, yangban, in the Joseon period, there are many interesting episodes about these yangban. They drank too much soju and suddenly died, even royal family members. And then soju was also used as medicine by the court historians. And a court historian of the early Joseon period, Hyunhee, even wrote a book titled Sangayorok, Essential Record of Family Villages. And he wrote another book about medicine, and that talks about soju, how to use soju as medicine, but it doesn't show how to make soju. But this book, Essential Records of Family Villages, actually gives the first description about how to make soju. So it's a very important document, but it's interesting. It doesn't give very detailed explanation about how to distill it. So it focuses more on how to ferment the alcoholic base, the fermented grain, and and it introduces some kinds of soju made of barley and other ingredients. So we can see people who read this book learn about different kinds of soju along with many other alcoholic drinks, mostly the fermented drink. So you remember the Korea period sources don't talk about how to make soju. It just talk about the consumption of soju among the people. But from the Choson period, we began to see the specific recipes of soju and how to make it. So this Jeonsunni's document doesn't show how to distill compared to some more clearer descriptions about distilling alcohol found in China in the Mongol period and later. But a later period sources, like a late 17th century source by, it's like diary by a person who was drifted in the sea, provides a wonderful hint about how to distill soju. And so his name is Yi Jihang. And so while adrift at sea, he tried to distill seawater to drink because he needed water and to drink, and he distilled seawater as if he were distilling soju by this boiling pot method described by Jeonsunni. So he describes like how he put the seawater in a pot, closed the pot lid upside down, and received only half a bowl of distilled water, which dripped from the lid of the pot. And indeed, it tasted plain. So he was able to drink seawater by using this distillation technology. So I didn't actually had a chance to talk about different kind of distilling technologies. And the distillation technology and techniques popular in the Mongol period in China had two types. The Mongol type that they put cup inside the pot and they boil the fermented alcohol, and then they receive the condensed alcoholic drops through the distillation process using different boiling points of different ingredients. And there was another more complicated type of steel. It's called Chinese steel. The scholar Joseph Needham categorized the two different steels. So more primitive style of steel called Mongolian steel, and the Chinese steel that is the one that uses a tube to remove alcohol from the pot through to outside receiving cup. So so there have been some debates about what kind of steel were introduced from China, the Yuan dynasty of the Mongol rule, to Korea. And some people say probably complicated one was introduced because the soju spread very quickly. But actually, I argue that because the Mongols were moving fast as soldiers, and so they used very simple the Mongol style distillation method using just one pot, and they just put receiving cup inside the pot. So because they use this simple technology, then probably soju using the simple distillation technology spread fast. So we can assume that first the more primitive style steels transferred from and spread in Korea, and as soju developed further in the mid and late Choson period, they developed more complicated steel to distill soju more efficiently. And so the case of Yi Jihang's distilling water using distilling soju shows that shows like how they distill soju in early. And also we see some other descriptions about stills called soju gori in the mid Choson period, and they use different kind of stills using bronze, earth, and iron, different kind of materials. And the court even used silver steel so that they can check if the alcohol has any poison. And throughout the Choson period, it seems like many people drank too much, and it caused the social problem, and also the shortage of grains. That was probably more important reason. And because Korean soju was made from fermented grain, especially rice, and also barley in Jeju Island, because rice doesn't grow there much. So these grains were not sufficient all the time, and so the court had to order bans of making alcohol at home. So, and a late Joseon period scholar, a well-known Confucian scholar called Jung Yak-yong, he's also known for his like practical learning writings, and he asked the court to ban soju because especially soju takes a lot of grains, and of course entire alcohol ban, but he says soju especially takes a lot of grain. So and he asked suggested that the government confiscate different kind of steels from the households, so we can steels made of bronze or earth. We don't have archaeological excavations, but we have this kind of lot of documentary sources, and so they confiscate all these, take out all these steels so that people cannot make soju. So we don't know how effective this kind of bans were, but you can see they were concerned about kind of large consumption of soju at the time, and also in the mid to late century, we began to see a lot of cookbooks, and two earliest cookbooks were from the Andong region. Andong is famous for Andong soju, and so the earliest cookbooks are actually from Andong region, which is famous for the Andong soju, and they also give a lot of recipes about soju. And the second author is actually Lady Chang of Andong. And this is the first cookbook written by a female author in the Choson period. And she talks about how to make soju. And her explanation is not very systematic, but we can reconstruct the mass distillation methods. And we can find here a very important feature of Korean soju compared to the distilled liquors in other countries like China. In China, they produced shaojiu or baijiu later as like in a mass scale for festivals and also for commerce. But in Korea, there are a lot of alcohol bans, and it seems like they didn't allow this kind of commercial scale distillation, at least in the early and mid Joseon period. And so they developed a very special brewing culture called family brewing culture, like 가양주. So this Gayangju is Korean home brew culture. So I should say that. And so each household, especially Yangban family, we don't know about ordinary people and because it's very expensive. So each Yangban family household brew alcohols, including soju, and they began to write this kind of recipes of alcohols so it was important for this Confucian Yangban family to welcome guests, and then they provide alcoholic drinks along with food, and also they also used soju as medicine. And so we have some very interesting episodes. So Yangban had his servant sick with a strange disease, and he had him to drink soju, and then his disease was cured. And each household of the Yangban family also had to brew alcoholic drinks at home, developing this home brewing culture because of the ancestral worship, the Confucian rituals. So the Choson dynasty had Neo-Confucianism as its state ideology, and actually Neo-Confucianism is very interesting too. It was transferred from China to Korea in the late Koryo period. And Neo-Confucianism was developed in the Song dynasty before the Mongol dynasty, but actually it's the Mongols who adopted Neo-Confucianism as for the governmental civil service examination. And many Koryo scholars, including Isek, who described the arak liquor in late Koryo period. He also was influenced by this Neo-Confucianism, and these scholars brought Neo-Confucianism to Korea in the late Koryo period, and actually it influenced the Choson period. And according to this Neo-Confucianism, the ancestor worship, the rites, rituals are very important, and they had to actually use specific types of alcoholic beverages, and not soju, because soju is not written in the ritual textbooks. It's not written by the Jushi and other Neo-Confucian scholars. And it's because in the Song dynasty, soju was not popular, even though probably it existed at the time. And the soju, shaojiu became popular in the Mongol period. So strictly following the Neo-Confucian rituals, they should not use soju for ancestral worships. But they gave an exception. So they became very practical. Only in the summer, they were allowed to use soju because in the summer, the regular fermented liquors, fermented alcohols get bad very easily. But soju, as a distilled liquor, is preserved for a longer time. It doesn't get bad in the very hot summer weather. So the soju, one of the great advantages of soju is that we can keep this for a longer time. And some people say forever without putting it in the refrigerator. So we see a lot of uses of soju in the Choson period. And in the late Choson period, by the 19th century, so the Korean government had big tax reform in 1708. It's called Daedong법, Law of Daedong, and that lessened the peasantry's tax burden. And the economy began to rise, and people began to have more grain. So it seems like people began to distill more soju. And in the late Joseon period, we also see that many more a great variety of cookbooks began to appear, and it talks a lot about different kind of soju recipes. Some of them were influenced from China, so we can guess that soju became more widespread and consumed at a large scale in Choson society. But we actually should note that soju was not the most dominant liquor in the Choson period yet, because it was actually the just regular fermented alcohol called shaojiu, clear strained wine, that were popular for ancestor rituals, and so that was more dominant form. But still, soju as distilled liquor with very special characteristics of preservability and strong taste also began to be popular gradually. And the Choson dynasty fell in late 19th century, and then actually the Korea were under Japanese rule from the early 20th century. And from that time on, the Korea soju would go through another big transformation in the history of soju in Korea.
So let's talk about that transformation here. So as you mentioned, the Choson dynasty ends and Japanese colonial period begins, and a huge transformation happens. It becomes much more industrialized, it seems, and much more popular. So take us to the Japanese colonial period, and how does soju change at this time?
So Korea from 1910 to 1945, like 35 years, were under Imperial Japan, Japan's colonial rule. So unlike Korea and China that resisted Western influences, the Japan quickly adopted Western technologies and Western political systems, and it entered actually the colonial ventures started by the Western countries, and the first country that Imperial Japan colonized is Korea. And the Korea was under Japanese rule against its own will, and the Japanese introduced a lot of Western technologies and industries. So the Koreans there were Koreans who were involved in the industries, and in fact, the soju industry boomed, and the technology and the machines the Japanese brought were actually from the Great Britain and Europe, where the Europeans gradually improved this distillation technology through the Industrial Revolution. So Japanese adopted this Western technology, and then they brought this to Korea, which was their colony, and they built a lot of soju companies there, but many Koreans also took advantage of these industry advantages, and so the soju boomed, and we have very interesting report by the Japanese rulers on the Korean Peninsula, and so they sent like scholars and anthropologists to different parts of Korean Peninsula, and they checked what kind of soju were available, and actually the first depictions of distilled apparatuses, the stills, Korean still soju gori, were drawn at the time, and later scholars actually used that to reconstruct soju gori. And so this report talks about the situation of soju and distilling method in late Choson period and early Japanese imperial rule period, and then they say the Korean methods are too various. There's no good standard, and of course they wanted to emphasize those aspects so they could introduce their more modern technologies. And so anyway, so gradually, and also the Japanese took a lot of text from soju, and scholars say 30% of text that they took from Korea or from the text from the liquor text. So it was huge. And so also it shows that the soju industry also boomed. But the traditional soju, which were brewed and distilled in each household, the home brew culture gradually declined from that time on. And so industrial soju began to rise. And even after the independence, Korea's independence from Japanese colonial rule, then still the Korea was suffering from the grain shortage. So the government in the late the second half of the 20th century actually banned using grain to brew or distill alcohol and soju. So then instead they imported a lot of potatoes from other countries, and they promoted industrial soju using the modern machines. And so they were able to take out alcohol, ethanol, spirit from potato or tapioca using continuous distillation methods, using big modern machines. And so this industrial soju began to be popular in Korea. And then we cannot see the traditional soju because it declined, and its tradition was kind of cut off at the time. But from 1980s, the government thought they have to host some big international events like 88 Olympics. So they began to actually encourage the people to bring their traditional recipes transferred from the earlier ancestor, from to generations to generation. And based on these recipes, some people began to revive traditional sojus. And they also claim the Mongol period origins, and Andong and Jeju and Jindo, these places were actually the places where the Mongol army camps were located. And but some scholars and also I actually think it's too much to bring these connections to the Koryo period. Also, the Andong was not a major point for the Mongol army too. But I argue that actually Andong was important in the development of soju because Andong is a very important place for the Yangban families, and they developed this home brewing culture for Confucian rituals and so on. So anyway, so many Korean people began to drink soju, and not much even the just fermented drink like cheongju. So soju became actually the most important and most popular drink, alcoholic drink in Korea. And there's another transformation I should mention is in the 21st century. So soju was consumed mostly inside Korea by the end of 20th century. But in 21st century, the Korea became popular. Many Korean cultures, including dramas and K-pops and Korean foods, became popular in other countries in the globalizing world. So, people say that it's thanks to really the big popularity of the K-pops and drama. So the people in foreign countries watch Korean dramas where people eat Korean foods like K-barbecue, bulgogi, and also drinking soju, like green bottle. So they were curious and they began to go to Korean restaurants and drink soju. So as I said earlier, it's industrial soju that made Korean soju popular.
And there is one other important connection here we should touch on, and this is this connection between soju and Mexico. So I might get you to explain that to us before we come to a final question.
Oh, yeah, thank you. So that's what I discussed in my chapter 6. And before Mexico, let me talk a little more about the case of Japan. So I just talked about the transfer of modern techniques and machines from Japan to Korea in the 20th century. But before that, actually, the soju was transferred from Korea to Japan too. Yeah, in the early modern period from 16th and 17th century. And so in chapter 6, I talked about Japan and Mexico just to encourage more people to study the topic of soju from more comparative perspective. And I chose the case of Japan and the case of Mexico. And the Japan's case is interesting because it shows direct connections. So Japan is very close, and it had a lot of cross-cultural context between Korea and Japan. And of course, there were wars, Japanese invasions in 1592. But they exchanged also a lot of cultural things, especially Japanese brought a lot of cultural elements from Korea and China, and soju is one of them. And but there are different theories. So I mentioned that soju was brought to Japan as a diplomatic gift. But it's interesting that soju and distilled liquor didn't become popular in Japan. It seems like some people in Tokyo knew about soju and they drank soju, but and it's shaojiu in Japanese, and so let me call it shochu. It's similar characters, and so Japanese shochu became popular more in the southern part of Japanese islands, Kyushu, and also Okinawa. So they are quite close to Korea. But there are other theories like the route from Korea to Japan and transfer route from China to Japan, and because China also had a lot of contacts and exchanges with Japan too, and also from the Thailand into Okinawa. So, but these are all possible, and we cannot deny that some amount of soju were brought from Korea to Japan. And once distilled liquor, the shochu, began to appear in Japan, it didn't become very popular because they have very systematic manufacturing system for sake. Is just fermented alcohol like shaojiu. And sake became the national kind of very the most famous popular drink in Japan. But Japanese also began to enjoy sake in late 20th century. So actually, it's the Japanese who brought the distillation machine from Europe to Japan and introduced that to Korea. But still, they so for them, like sake was more popular. They produced more sake. But in the late 20th century, they also had the sudden shaojiu boom, distilled spirit boom. So and they invented a lot of machines, and so they began to invent a lot of different kinds of shochu brands, and they became also very popular. And I saw a bottle of shochu. It says soju / and shochu. So yeah, I wonder if that wanted to show the connections and actually the transfer of soju to Japan and as the origin of shochu. And so this is an example of a direct influence of Korean soju to other countries and direct connections. And the Mexico, that's really surprising case, and it's because it's very far it's in the New World, it's Americas. And actually, I began to be interested in this whole soju and distilled liquor project because of my good colleague, Dr. Ana Valenzuela. She is an expert of distilled liquor in Mexico called Mezcal and Tequila. And so it's interesting that the Mexican distilled liquors also have a lot of debates about the origins of Mezcal and Tequila. So some scholars say that the native Mexican people there had distilled liquor before the Spanish, the Europeans came to the place. But some people say actually the Europeans brought the distilled liquor that began to be popular there after the Mongol period. And some people say even the ancient origin is very similar to the debates about distilled liquor in other societies like China. So the scholars actually really bring a lot of different methods, and they try to also look at our anthropological evidence. So there are a lot of illegal brewing and distilling of mezcal in the western part of Mexico, and then they did anthropological research, and then they found out that the stills they were using are quite similar to the stills used in Asia, in China and Mongolia, and also Korea. So I was so surprised that one of the stills is exactly like the soju gori displayed in Andong Soju Museum and other places. So I was very interested in that, and I wanted to find any connections. And so my conclusion is that it's difficult to argue a direct connection between Korea and Mexico, because the Spanish actually went to Mexico from after like 1500, and there was a great trade route called Manila Galleon connecting the Philippines and then the Acapulco in Mexico. And so through this Manila Galleon, the merchants, the Spanish and the Filipino merchants brought the popular distilled liquor there, like shaojiu or arak, and then also including the technology and the techniques and methods, they brought it to Mexico. And so even though the natives had like some distillation practice earlier, at least the new technology like Asian style stills definitely influenced these people, and so we cannot say the direct connections, but so we can see the connections through the Mongol period, the spread of distillation, and the spread of the stills, different kind of stills, Chinese type stills and more primitive Mongol type stills. And those things were transferred to Korea and a little later also to Mexico through another connections. And also in Mexico too, like Korea, it seems like first they also had more primitive Mongol style still, but gradually they also began, they actually have more Chinese style stills that can distill tequila and mezcal more efficiently. And they also are going through similar process. So nowadays, they also use modern machines to produce tequila on a large scale. And also it became one of the famous global spirits, like soju.
And this is a great place to go into the final question. And the final question, of course, is going to be about the current moment, where we are today with soju. Because as you mentioned a few times, everyone is very interested in Korea today. The Korean wave is washing over the world, and soju is becoming more popular. But it is also not just a popular drink, it is also a national icon of sorts. So as a last question, where are we today with soju and its global influence?
Yes, that's a great question. So as I mentioned earlier, so it's the industrial soju developed in from the 20th century that made soju like global, and soju that's consumed by the Koreans and the people in the globe the most. And we can find the soju bottles in many supermarkets in the US, in other countries. I saw many soju bottles in Mongolia too. So, but actually, the people who really like spirits, who like deep and rich taste of traditional soju, often dislike the industrial soju. So some people even say that's not soju. So industrial soju is not soju. So that's why at the very beginning of today's interview, it was not easy to define soju. So, but actually, I argue that even though these two types of soju, industrial soju and the revived traditional soju, are very different, but still they share some technology, techniques, and scientific theories, and also history. So I showed you some broad, long-term historical trajectories of the development of soju in different historical contexts, from the Mongol period, and actually the distillation technologies goes back to ancient period, and the Mongol period spread of distilled liquor, and then its introduction to Korea, and the localization and further development in Choson period, and then new transformations in the 20th century using the machines, and then another transformation, global turn of soju, because it was exported to other cultures. So a lot of cultural, transnational exchanges that contributed to the development of soju. And so the industrial soju is made by mixing ethanol spirit of 95% alcohol with other flavors and water. And that distillation technology is actually using the same distillation principle, the theory. And the modern revived traditional sojus became popular. and this became actually a pride, national pride of the Korean soju. And even the people working in the industrial soju companies try to use like traditional distillation method and traditionally distilled soju to improve the taste of their industrial soju. So they try to mix all these different techniques, and so that was very interesting when I interviewed a director in a soju company in South Korea, and it's also interesting to see that the soju companies and the soju manufacturers are making a lot of efforts to improve the taste of their soju brands. So there are many different kinds of industrial soju. And of course, there are more well-known soju, like Jillo soju. It's now #1 selling spirit in the world. And but some other soju companies, they also make a lot of research to using different techniques to improve their the taste of their soju brands. And also a lot of new small companies began to revive the traditional style soju. So it was several brands of traditional soju that the government promoted based on the recipes from the Choson period. And so in the late 20th century, and now even small companies, big companies, they also improve their technology, the machines to make soju using machines. So the principle, the methods are the same. They are not just using small steel used in the Choson period, but using like big machines similar to those used for whiskey, but they try to follow the specific recipes, like how many times or how long they ferment the base liquor, and then and so on. So and we see like more brands, and we can also see soju brands made in other countries. So far I know several brands made in the Toki soju. Toki is rabbit, and it's started by Brandon Hill, who first started this soju brewing, distilling in Brooklyn, New York City. And now he actually moved to Korea, and but he's using rice, like traditional ingredient for soju making. So and it became very popular. Even we can find the Toki soju in many restaurants in New York City. And there are several other brands, like some brands in New York City, and some brands started by Korean Americans. So yeah, so it's interesting to see how far the soju would become evolve over time based on this popularity. And anyway, so it's industrial soju still is industrial soju that are more popular in other countries, and it's very cheap too. So it's one of the cheapest spirit in the world. So probably that contributed to its popularity. So like $4 to $5 in the U.S. market, and in Korea we can buy it in a supermarket in $1 to $2. And they also a lot of Koreans drink soju as a cocktail, mixing with beer, and that actually makes the soju, the cocktail, very strong, and this bomb shot. And this kind of soju drinking culture also influence the other societies too in the U.S. and So many Americans are very interested in this kind of soju culture, and then also soju is not as strong as other like traditional like more like, famous like global spirits like vodka and whiskeys that have like more than 40% of alcohol. Traditional soju has that strong alcohol content, but industrial soju is around like 20% and even lower. So even the supermarkets in other countries can sell it without having a liquor license. So that also contributed to the spread of soju. And frankly speaking, I don't drink soju very much, but I was really fascinated by this topic because of this transcultural aspects and or transformations over time in different historical contexts. And also this people's wisdom and scientific development. That they use this technology to make the to make it stay longer time, not easily rotten. So in the pre-modern period, that meant a lot when they didn't have refrigerators. So they were able to keep more soju, more alcohol beverage, and they can use it for many things like medicine and food. And I also read very interesting news last year after this global pandemic of the COVID-19 started, that actually the soju companies, the industrial soju companies in Korea, promptly donated their ethanol spirit that they use to make soju to the society, so that they can use this ethanol spiritus to sterilize against the COVID virus. So I was really interested in various kind of uses that this kind of alcohol, especially strong alcohol, provides. And so I wrote about soju, and actually there are many other spirits in the world like arak that we can study further in connection to soju. So in chapter 6, I was not able to pursue that out because of the space limit, but after the Mongol period, so arak liquor spread further west in Iran and Central Asia, and they became popular too. So I hope that my case study of Korean soju would contribute to studies of spirits in global history. And many of my colleagues working on other spirits and alcoholic beverages and foods showed their enthusiasm on my soju book. And I also wanted to say that I also hope more studies about Korea would put Korea from this kind of global perspectives, and also focusing on cultural aspects, not just political relations, because there are really many rich and very interesting topics related to these cultural context and cultural developments in Korea through its global context.
And your book, I'm sure, has gone a long way to doing that as well. It's been an absolute pleasure talking with you. So I should mention again, the book that we've been speaking about today throughout the interview is called Soju, A Global History, published by the University of Cambridge Press. And as I said, it's been an absolute pleasure. Hyunhee, thanks for joining me on the podcast.
Thank you so much for asking many excellent questions.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the podcast. I really hope you enjoyed it. This is just a final reminder that we've made a conscious decision here on the Korean Out podcast not to run advertising. And so the podcast is entirely funded by you, the listener. So if you do want it to continue, please consider supporting the podcast at the PayPal or Patreon links attached below. Or importantly, you can share, like, or comment on the podcast across social media. And on that, I hope to see you again for the next episode. Thanks again for listening.